April 3rd, 2022, Miami, Florida, 22nd floor, One Palacio luxury condominiums. The afternoon had been quiet. 2 people, 2 dogs, a Sunday that started like any other. Subway sandwiches on the counter, a couple who had spent the morning in the same space without incident. By 4:57, one of them was on the phone screaming for help. The other was on the floor, bleeding out from a knife wound that had punctured his artery. He could be heard in the background saying he was dying and that he couldn't feel his arms. She called 911. She said she was sorry. She said she threw the knife from 10 feet away. The medical examiner would say otherwise. And that contradiction is where this entire case lives. Welcome to GBRLIFE Transmissions. I'm your host, Caitlin, and you're listening to GBRLIFE of Crimes, where we explore not just what happened in crimes committed by women, but why they happened, and the psychology behind them. Today, we're getting into one of the most contested, most dissected, and most talked about cases in the last few years. A case that lives at the intersection of social media fame, domestic violence, race, privilege, and a question that a jury has still not answered. Who was the victim? And who was the aggressor? This is the story of Courtney Clenney. Courtney Tyler Clenney was born on April 21st, 1996, in Midland, Texas, oil country. It's flat, with a big sky. The kind of place where ambition either takes root very quietly or it just doesn't take at all. She was 7 years old when her family relocated to Austin, and by all accounts, she was a kid who threw herself into everything: soccer, volleyball, gymnastics, horse riding, competitive diving. She was not someone who sat still. She was constantly testing herself and constantly reaching for the next thing. This was not unusual for a child, but it's worth paying attention to because we tend to see that in people who channel everything into a performance, into physical achievement, into building an image of themselves that others will admire. Is that somewhere underneath all of that activity? There is something that needs managing, whether that was anxiety or a need for external validation or simply a personality wired toward intensity. We can't know that for certain. But what we do know is that even as a child, Courtney Clenney was building herself for an audience. And at 13, she gave up competitive diving. She decided she wanted to act. That was specific, a very deliberate choice. You do not tell your parents at 13 that you're done with the sport that you've been training in for years and that you're going to take acting classes and voice lessons and dance classes unless you have a very clear picture of who you want to be. And she started doing local modeling in Austin. She landed a small commercial role and got uncredited film appearances. She was not waiting to be discovered. She was engineering it. By the time she finished high school, she was already deciding college was not part of the plan. The entertainment industry was the goal, and she moved to Los Angeles to pursue it directly. What she found there was that the industry did not simply open up for her the way she imagined. She got small roles, a Linklater film in 2016, and some work in a music video, even a Playboy shoot. But the big break that she had been building toward was not materializing in the traditional sense. So she built it herself on Instagram. She documented her fitness journey, her body, her workouts, her competition prep for NPC bikini competitions, which she won. And something about that combination, the authenticity of the journey alongside the aspirational image, clicked for an audience. Within a few years, she had crossed 2 million followers. Brands paid her, and she became what the internet calls an influencer. Though that word flattens something important. She had spent her entire life constructing a public self, and Instagram was simply the most efficient vehicle she had ever found for doing it. When OnlyFans entered the picture, she made that pivot too. Reports indicate that she earned close to $3 million in revenue over roughly 2 years on that platform. And by 2020, Courtney Clenney was 24 years old, financially successful, publicly visible, and living in Austin. She had built exactly the life that she had been engineering since childhood. And then she met Christian Obumseli. The question this show always asks is not just what happened, it's also that why. So when we look at Courtney's childhood, what do we see? We see someone who learned very early that performance earns approval, that achievement is identity, and that control over your image is power. Those are not pathological traits on their own. Millions of successful people are wired exactly that way, but they do create a particular kind of person, someone who may not have well-developed tools for conflict that can be managed, filtered, or controlled. Someone who, when in a relationship, becomes the one place where the performance breaks down, and who might not know what to do with that. That matters. And keep that in the back of your mind as we go. So back to Christian. Christian was born in 1994 in Dallas, Texas. 2 years older than Courtney, Nigerian American, raised with what his family described as strong values and a strong moral foundation. He went by the name Toby. People who knew him described him as radiant, not in the polished, curated way that Courtney was publicly radiant, but in the way that some people say simply lit up the room without even trying. He was a connector. He remembered your name. He asked follow-up questions. He made people feel genuinely seen in a way that is actually rare. And that kind of warmth tends to create deep loyalty in the people around you. Christian was successful in his own right. He played college football as a linebacker. And after school, he moved into cryptocurrency trading, which in the early 2020s was a world of young men with laptops, fast money, and a high tolerance for risk, which means he was sharp and he was building. And by the time he met Courtney in November of 2020, he had a life of his own, ambitions of his own, and enough self-awareness to know what he wanted. His family says that he was a soft-spoken man, someone who did not look for confrontation, and someone who, when things got hard in his personal life, tended to absorb rather than escalate. And that profile matters too. And it matters for a painful reason, because what we see in the record of this relationship is that a man who friends and family describe as gentle and warm, and who also wrote in a text message to the woman that he loves, "Is love going to kill me?" He wrote that months before it did. Either way, the two met in November of 2020, and they began dating almost instantly. They were living in Austin at the time, in a penthouse apartment at the Berkshire Riverview. And from early on, neighbors noticed, not in a charming, lively couple way, in this is a problem kind of way, that police were called to the building multiple times. At one point during a fight, a piece of art was thrown from their unit and landed on the balcony of the apartment on the 10th floor below them. The fight was so physically explosive that a framed painting left their apartment and landed one floor down on someone else's balcony. This was not a relationship that occasionally got heated. This was a relationship defined by volatility. And the evidence that we have access to tells a complicated story about who was driving that volatility. In July of 2021, Courtney was arrested in Las Vegas and charged with domestic battery against Christian at a hotel. That arrest is in the public record. Also in the public record are text messages from Christian's own phone. We've already discussed one of them. And in October of 2021, he wrote to Courtney describing being stabbed in the leg during one of their fights. He said the pain was so bad he could barely walk. In those same messages, he described being sliced in the face with a knife and having his stitches slapped open before they could heal. He also described being cheated on, being called racial slurs, being kicked out of the apartment they shared. A recording that he allegedly made secretly on his phone captured Courtney using that slur at him during an argument, and yet he stayed. He kept coming back. He described bending himself to keep the peace. He wrote that he sacrificed his pride over and over again, telling himself he did not need to win, that he should just let her have her way. This is one of the most psychologically important and under-discussed aspects of this case, because it challenges both narratives. If Christian was the abuser that the defense claims, why was he the one writing about sacrificing his ego and absorbing the chaos? If Courtney was the cold-blooded aggressor that the prosecution implies, why did she keep calling 911? and keep spiraling in ways that did not look like someone who was in control. The honest answer is that high-conflict relationships with mutual violence rarely has a clean victim and a clean perpetrator. What they tend to have instead is two people who are genuinely traumatizing each other, often because one of them or both of them have never learned how to exit a situation before it detonated. Basically, trauma bonds are real, and the cycle of rapture and repair in a volatile relationship can create an attachment so intense that leaving feels physically impossible, even when staying is destroying you. And Courtney was also dealing with documented substance use. She later sought rehabilitation treatment for PTSD and substance abuse. But that does not excuse anything. But it is relevant to understanding the kind of mental state that she was likely operating in throughout the entire relationship. The couple eventually left Austin and moved to Miami in January of 2022. Oftentimes, couples will do this. They think, if we just go to a new city, it's a reset. But it was not a reset. Building staff began documenting their arguments almost immediately. Tenants 2 floors above their unit complained about the noise, and management had been considering eviction proceedings. Police were called to the unit at least 4 times in the months that they had lived there. And in February of 2022, surveillance cameras in the building's elevator captured one of the altercations on video. The footage shows Courtney pushing, shoving, and jumping on Christian while he turns his back and presses buttons on the panel, trying to disengage. His body language throughout is one of a person trying to make the situation just stop. Hers is of one of someone who cannot let it stop. And the prosecution would later use this footage as a central piece of evidence. The defense would argue that it captured one moment in a relationship where the violence went in both directions, and that this particular clip did not tell the whole story. And at the end of March 2022, Courtney kicked Christian out of the apartment. They broke up for about a week. He was gone, but on April 1st, he was back. She let him in 2 days before she would be arrested for his murder. In those 2 days, police were called to the apartment again, and officers noted that Courtney appeared intoxicated when she spoke with them. And then 2 days after that was April 3rd. By all accounts, the morning of April 3rd was calm. As I said in the beginning of all of this, the couple clearly spent time home together with their dogs, and nothing about the early part of the day suggested what was coming. That is almost always how it goes in cases like this one. The worst moments in violent relationships do not always announce themselves. They arrive in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and at 1:15 p.m., Christian left the apartment with the dogs. He came back at 4:33, carrying Subway sandwiches. He had gone out to get food for the both of them. He was coming home. And at 4:43, Courtney called her mother. The call lasted 6 minutes. At 4:49, she called her mother again. They spoke for 7 minutes. During that second call, her mother later told investigators she could hear Courtney yelling at Christian and accusing him of lying. The argument was escalating in real time while Courtney was on the phone. Investigators later found a text message from her mother on Courtney's phone, received at 5:25 p.m. It mentioned self-defense and advised Courtney not to speak to the police without an attorney present. At 4:57 p.m., Courtney called 911. "My boyfriend is dying of a stab wound." What followed on that recording is one of the most disturbing pieces of audio in this entire case. Courtney is screaming, the dogs are barking, and in the background, clearly audible, is Christian. He is telling the dispatcher he's going to die because he can't feel his arms. Courtney can be heard saying that she's sorry over and over. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." She's begging someone to come. She's begging God. When officers arrived, blood tracked from the kitchen island through the master bedroom and bathroom and back into the living room. A knife was on the floor near the couch. Christian was transported to the hospital, but he did not survive. The wound had pierced his artery. Body cam footage captured Courtney in the hallway, covered in blood, hysterical, begging to be let back inside. She told officers, "I need him. He's my other half." When she was interviewed, she told them what happened from her perspective. Christian had pushed her against the wall by her neck. He shoved her to the ground, and then, from approximately 10 feet away, she threw a knife, and it went into his chest. But the medical examiner's findings directly contradicted that account because the wound was 3 inches deep. It traveled in a downward trajectory through soft tissue and muscle, piercing the artery on the right side of his chest. The examiner determined that penetrating that deeply would require a minimum of 8 to 12 pounds of force. That wound, the examiner concluded, was not consistent with a thrown knife. It was consistent with a forceful, deliberate, downward thrust. And Courtney showed no visible injuries. She was handcuffed, interviewed, and released pending investigation. She walked out of that building the same night that Christian died in a hospital. For the next 4 months, his family waited. They were not waiting because they had been notified and were being kept informed. They were waiting because they did not even know that he was gone at first. Police never called them. His family found out 2 days after his death when the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine contacted them to ask where they would like to donate his organs. They thought it was a prank call. Think about that. Christian's family received a call from the medical school about donating his organs before a single officer thought to pick up the phone. The family flew to Miami immediately, and they met with detectives and came away feeling dismissed. The family's attorney, Larry Hanfield, said publicly what many people were already saying privately, that if Courtney had been a 26-year-old Black woman and Christian had been a white man with millions of followers and immediate legal representation, that there would have been an arrest the night of the incident. He said privilege played a role in that delay. He said it plainly. Christian was a 27-year-old Black man. Courtney is a white woman who, in the immediate aftermath of a man dying in her apartment, had the resources to retain counsel before she spoke to anyone. Those facts do not exist in a vacuum. Courtney's attorney pushed back on that framing, saying that if her account had been inconsistent with the physical scene, she should have been arrested immediately. The Miami Police Department maintained that they needed time to build a comprehensive case. The medical examiner's finding had complicated the initial read of the scene, and investigators were working through warrants for phones and social media accounts and records from out-of-state law enforcement. The picture took shape slowly, and in August of 2022, police located Courtney in Hawaii. Think about that. She was in Hawaii, and her attorney said that she had traveled there for rehabilitation treatment for PTSD and substance abuse. She was arrested and brought back to Miami and charged with second-degree murder with a deadly weapon. And she has been in custody ever since and held without bond. And she maintains that she acted in self-defense. If the crime itself was layered and contested, what followed in the legal system became something else entirely. In January of 2024, nearly 2 years after Christian's death, Courtney's parents, Kim and Deborah Clenny, were arrested in Texas. The charge was unauthorized access to a computer. Investigators alleged that after Courtney's arrest, the family had accessed Christian's laptop, which was evidence in the murder investigation, and coordinated its transfer to one of Courtney's attorneys in Dallas. And then they discovered text messages that documented that coordination in detail. Deborah texted the group chat that she was driving to Dallas to drop off the laptop. The attorney confirmed the receipt. The logistics were laid out in writing, and the charges against the parents were eventually dropped. But the reason they were dropped opened an entirely different wound in this case. Investigators had executed a warrant for the family's shared iCloud account. What they found inside was not just communication about the laptop. They found an entire group chat called Team Courtney that included Courtney, her parents, her attorneys, the attorneys' paralegals, and their investigators. The chat contained detailed discussions about defense strategy, witness preparation, expert witness decisions, financial considerations, and the defense team's working theories about the case. In other words, the prosecutors had read the entire defense playbook. A judge ruled that obtaining those communications violated attorney-client privilege. The lead prosecutor on the case withdrew, and motions were filed to disqualify the entire Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office from the case. The judge restricted what the state could access going forward and what they could use. It was one of the most significant prosecutorial missteps in a high-profile case in recent Florida history. The defense also raised allegations about the original crime scene. Building security had taken photographs and recorded video before police and EMS arrived. Clenny's attorney argued those recordings were deleted at the direction of responding officers, erasing what could have been unfiltered early documentation of the scene, including what Courtney said and how she behaved before law enforcement started processing the space. The prosecution disputed that, but the allegation added another layer of doubt to an already complicated evidentiary picture. At one point during pretrial hearings, a judge told both sides with visible frustration that this case was not going to be a telenovela. The trial was scheduled for April 27th of this year, 2026, but it was delayed again because both sides filed a joint continuance, and as of now, it is expected to begin sometime in the summer of 2026. Courtney Clenney has been in Miami-Dade jail for nearly 4 years without a trial, without a verdict, and without a resolution. So here's what I keep coming back to in this case. We want there to be a clear villain. That's human, because that is how we are wired to process stories about violence. Someone did something terrible. Someone suffered. And justice means identifying which is which and assigning the right label to the right person. I'm sure you've already done that as you were listening to this case. But the truth is some cases resist that. Not because the truth is unknowable, but because the truth is often more complicated than the story we want to tell about it. Courtney grew up learning that performance equals worth, that control over your image is power. That is not trauma narrative, not necessarily, but it is a personality structure that underneath the specific pressure of an intimate relationship where performance has to drop and where you cannot filter the version of yourself someone else sees, it can produce a very particular kind of crisis, especially if you layer substance use on top of it, and especially if the relationship has normalized physical conflict as a way of communicating. Christian himself, by every account, from pretty much anyone who loved him, was a warm and gentle person. He was a man who wrote in his own words that he kept sacrificing his pride to preserve a relationship that was actively harming him. He stayed through documented incidents of physical violence, and he came back 2 days before he died. That's not weakness. That is a clear trauma bond, and that is the psychological reality of what intense, volatile rapture and repair relationships do to the nervous system of someone who genuinely loves the person causing the harm. Both of those things can be true at the same time. A person can be a victim and also not entirely without fault in how a dynamic developed. That does not mean they deserved what happened to them. Christian did not deserve to die, full stop. And what the prosecution argues is that the physical evidence, the medical findings, the wound trajectory, the absence of any injury on Courtney, and the pattern of her using weapons all points to a woman who killed her boyfriend and then constructed a self-defense narrative to explain it. What the defense argues is that the same physical evidence, viewed alongside Courtney's own history of documented injury in this relationship, and her immediate call to 911, and her behavior at the scene, and a relationship that the arrest warrant itself described as violent from both sides, paints a different picture. But a jury hasn't heard it yet, and that's the part that matters right now. Whatever we think happened in that apartment, it has not been decided in the only place where it legally can be. Christian was 27 years old. 1 week after he died, he would have been 28. And he asked, "Is love going to kill me?" in a text message months before it did. His family found out he was gone from a medical school asking about organ donation. And Courtney, 4 years, no trial, no verdict. So whatever comes out in the courtroom this summer will be some form of justice, but not enough to bring Christian back, and never enough closure to fix what happened. This has been GBRLIFE of Crimes, part of GBRLIFE Transmissions. I'm your host, Caitlin, reminding you that understanding the darkness helps us appreciate the light. Join me next time as we uncover another case that challenges everything we thought we knew about the criminal mind. Hey, it's Caitlin. If you stayed this long, thank you. And if you could take a moment to like and subscribe each time you listen to GBR Life Transmissions, that would mean the world. And don't forget to check out the reviews and blogs on gbrlife.com. Can't wait to see you there.